There are hundreds of basic and alternate recipes in Satisfactory 1.0. Some of them are absolutely amazing, whilst others not so much. So I've made it my mission in Satisfactory to compare every single recipe in the game to inform you guys on what the best and worst recipes are. So welcome to the best recipes in Satisfactory 1.0 series. This video is all about high-speed connectors. When it comes to these high-speed connectors, there are two main recipes. We've got the main high-speed connector basic recipe, as well as the silicon high-speed connector alternate recipe. These high-speed connectors are used to make a lot of things, such as supercomputers, automated wiring, electromagnetic control rods, which will be my next best recipe video coming out soon, as well as radio control units, or the connection unit alternate recipe. So in today's video, we'll be going over the two main recipes, whilst also exploring a secret third recipe, which you might really enjoy, or hate, it's depending on your playstyle. Starting with the basic high-speed connector recipe. Firstly, in all three of these recipes I'll be demonstrating today, we are making 4 high-speed connectors. And let's talk about these 3 main resources that we need: quick wire, cable, and circuit boards. I've made an entire video talking about circuit boards, but there is a main reason as to why I've selected this recipe in particular, and a few of you might have already spotted it. It doesn't require crude oil. And there's a reason as to why that is so important, because if we actually check the other circuit board recipes, we can see this requires plastic, which requires crude oil. Both of these require crude oil, and then again, more plastic down here. Whereas with this recipe, there is no crude oil involved. You could do this for multiple different reasons, the first of which is that you just don't want to get extra liquids involved, which is fair enough. And the second reason is you might not want to get crude oil involved because you might be saving it for future projects. So that is why I choose this circuit board recipe, but again, I have got an entire video going over every circuit board recipe that might help you out. Firstly, when it comes to the silica, we only need 8.8 per minute, which is roughly 5.3 raw quartz, which is essentially nothing. That's a really low amount, which is fantastic. And when it comes to copper sheets, I have mentioned this in a couple other videos, but there's multiple different ways that you can try and do this. For this example, we are needing 8.8 copper sheets, which no matter what else you do with the copper sheets, this is the exact amount that you need, so that always stays the same. But when it comes to the copper ingots, we need 17.6, which then ends up being 17.6 copper ore. But what if it wasn't? Oh dear. Introducing the refinery. Regular viewers of the channel know exactly where I'm going to go with this. So to make our 8.8 copper sheets that we now need, we only need 8.8 copper ingots rather than 17.6. However, we now have to get water involved. And let's take these 8.8 copper ingots and apply it to this recipe now, where now we only need 3.52 copper ore rather than 17.6. But of course, again, you do need additional water. This is a fantastic recipe if you are making tons of copper sheets, but I don't necessarily recommend it if you're only making a few. Despite saying that though, the refinery does obviously require more power, and it requires some water as well if you are making pure ingots. Speaking about pure ingots, you can also make a bunch of other ingot recipes involving water, such as pure iron ingots, caterium ingots, and also wet concrete, including quartz crystals using the pure quartz crystal recipe. So the refinery can be fantastic if you've got the power and the water nearby. I know I mention this a lot whenever I record these videos, but it's very important to touch upon it, especially for newer viewers. The second recipe I then want to talk about is my cable recipe. And you might be looking at this thinking I've made some massive mistake here. You can't make wire from iron. Except you can, using the iron wire recipe. The reason as to why I've chosen to use this for this recipe in particular is because I will be making a bunch of iron wire, thus making cable using iron, in my main factory. If you want to use copper here, that's completely fine. So take this with a pinch of salt, but for me personally, this is my favorite way to make cable, and that's with using iron. But for anyone curious, if you just want to use the copper recipe, to make your 80 wire, you need 40 copper ingots, and then if you just use the regular copper ore to copper ingot recipe, that then requires 40 copper ore. So that's not too bad either. Just very quickly, if you enjoy videos like this and you want more guides, tips and tricks, then feel free to subscribe if you wish. You don't have to, but it's a good way to support the channel. You'll also get notified whenever I drop one of these videos. Thank you for all the continued support on the channel, but without further ado, let's get straight back into the video. The last part of this recipe to touch on now is quick wire. And as you can see, again, I've done something a little bit different here. and I've involved copper, and quite a lot of copper at that. The main reason as to why I've done this, as you would probably expect, is to save on Caterium, because I'll be using quite a lot of Caterium in my world, so I want to try and save it where I can. If I wasn't to add copper to this recipe, this would require quite a lot more Caterium. But how much more? Well, let's double check. To make our 224 quickwire per minute, we are going to need almost 50 Caterium ingots, which might sound like quite a lot, but that roughly translates to 150 Caterium ore, which is a decent amount, especially considering we are only making 4 high-speed connectors here. Now compare that 150 Caterium ore with just this 57, you end up saving almost 100 Caterium ore, which, again, might not sound like a lot, but is a pretty big chunk of Caterium. Granted, yes, you do have to implement some copper into this, but I honestly think that is okay to save Caterium. If you're not fussed about Caterium though, then do not worry about this recipe, this might be fine for you, but again, if Caterium is a concern, that you might want to implement this into your recipes. So let's assess the resources used then for the high-speed connector. For the copper ore, you need 111.6 per minute, but of course, this goes up by an additional 40 if you choose to make your wire from copper. And regarding iron, you need 45 iron ore per minute, but again, this is technically 0 if you choose to make your iron wire from, again, regular copper wire. You need 57 Caterium and 5.3 raw quartz. This is not a bad recipe at all, but I've got a third recipe a bit later on in today's video that sort of improves a little bit on this, in my opinion at least. And let's take a quick gander at the machines used for this. We need 2 manufacturers, 4 assemblers, 9 constructors, and 9 smelters, all of which providing you with 152 megawatts worth of power being consumed. I have explained this in a couple of my videos previously, but I'll do it again very quickly. The reason as to why this says 57 megawatts worth of power rather than 110 megawatts worth of power, which is what 2 manufacturers would normally consume, is because neither of these manufacturers are actually operating at 100% efficiency. So that's the reason why the power is all different compared to what it might be if you're, again, were to times 4 assemblers by 15 megawatts, which is what it would then be if it was all operating at 100% efficiency. So that's the main reason as to why I've done that, so that this power down here is pretty much dead on what you then need to make your 4 high-speed connectors. Okay, brilliant. We've now talked about the first recipe, let's now move on to the second recipe, which is called silicon high-speed connectors, which, I mean, believe it or not, requires silica. Everything else, though, is pretty much the same. If we have a quick gander at our quickwire, though, we can see this only requires 120 quickwire, whereas our previous recipe required 224. So you are saving almost half of your Caterium, which, I mean, that's pretty cool. Same with your copper there as well. Regarding silica, I mean, this is just a pretty good recipe for it. It's a basic recipe, it's the easiest one to do. You need 30 raw quartz to make your 50 silica per minute. Fairly straightforward there. And regarding the circuit boards, we are only needing 4 per minute, which is the exact same as the previous recipe, so I won't dive into this too much. So you might have realized that we are using both circuit boards and quickwire again, the exact same like our first recipe. The only difference being either the silica or the cable. So how does this actually impact the resources being consumed? Well, now we are only consuming 67.6 copper per minute, 30 Caterium ore per minute, and 35.3 raw quartz. So no iron being consumed, and less copper and less Caterium, which sounds fantastic. And when we take a quick look in regards of manufacturers and other machines being used throughout this process and power consumption, we can see it requires less power, and we only use 2 manufacturers, 3 assemblers, 4 constructors, and 4 smelters. So less power being consumed, and less resources mostly required for this other than raw quartz. This is a really good recipe. But before I end today's video and crown the winner, I want to show you what one of these recipes looks like where we include pure ingots, which is what I was talking about a little bit earlier on today. And this recipe looks a bit more inflated, let's say, but trust me, it's actually not as bad as it looks. Starting off with quickwire, because again, this does look a lot worse than what it actually is. If we implement water into every single stage of the process where we actually can, we can see we actually end up saving a good amount of Caterium and a good amount of copper. Obviously now though, we need to use refineries, which consume more power, and now consume water. Are you near a water source? If not, then this is going to be a problem logistically for you. Are you going to use trains or vehicles to transport it? Are you going to transport it as a liquid or a solid? So quite a lot more factors are now added into the equation if you do choose to use pure ingots, but the whole purpose of them is that you end up saving resources, so one can't really complain, can there? Well, I still will, most likely, because that's what I do as a living. Next up, we have our cable, which we are making 40 cable per minute, as we were with the basic recipe, but now we only consume 25 iron ore per minute, rather than 45, which is, pretty decent. And lastly, and certainly not least, circuit boards. I've already touched upon the copper sheet recipe, which you may or may not want to implement, and of course silica just remains the same. This is still a very simple recipe, so we're not really going to change too much about that. I do very quickly want to discuss the machines being used and the power consumption as well, because as you might be able to see, holy moly, how has that happened? This is like over 100 megawatts extra compared to what we were using before. And that's all to do with our 8 refineries consuming 165 megawatts. Just to be clear, the refineries in this recipe alone are consuming more power than both of the other recipes, so this is a huge power demand. But again, you are making pure ingots, so there's a reason for that. Lastly, let's talk a little bit more about resources required. This requires 41.6 copper ore per minute, 25 iron ore, 38 caterium, 5.3 raw quartz, and 88.2 water per minute from the water extractor. So now let's compare all the resources. Regarding copper, the basic recipe consumes the most. And regarding iron consumption, again, the basic recipe consumes the most. In regards to caterium, the basic recipe consumes the most. But regarding raw quartz, the middle recipe consumes the most. However, you also save the most amount of power doing this, and you end up using less quickwire, which is great, and less copper. So it all comes down to the question, really. Do you want to save on caterium or raw quartz? If you're really desperately trying to save on raw quartz, you might prefer this recipe here, which is the pure ingot recipe, or just the basic recipe. However, if you're trying to save on copper, iron, caterium, and power, then this middle recipe is the best recipe for you. Despite the fact it does consume the most amount of raw quartz, it does end up saving you almost everything else. So this is actually a really good recipe, and in my opinion, the silicon high-speed connector is the best recipe in Satisfactory 1.0. In regards to the high-speed connectors at least. There it is, that concludes today's video. What recipe do you guys use? Let me know in the comments down below. Regardless, thank you very much for watching. Before we go, a massive thank you to the channel members, Chaos Rising, Scotland Hattie, Mau Mau, Natormal, Yamikael Burns, Variants, Asuna, Nicole Still Plays, and Zhao. If you decide to become a Knight of the Realm for just £2.99 a month, you get access to channel-only emotes, unique badges, and also shoutouts in videos. Memberships are the best way to support my channel, but you don't have to become a member. Even just by watching today's video, you are supporting the channel massively. Here's a couple more videos I've made that you might be interested in. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Have an amazing rest of your day, and remember, Godspeed.